All right, well, it was just last month that the movie Loving was released in theaters, a film based on the real-life story of how a couple defeated the state of Virginia's ban on interracial marriage in a landmark Supreme Court case. But decades before the Loving case, there was one prominent man who stood defiantly in the face of racism all on his own.
Well, tonight we're going to take an in-depth look at the life of Jack Johnson, a boxing legend who called New York home but died a criminal. PIX-11 News reporters Jay Dow, James Ford, and Mario Diaz taking a closer look at his legacy as Congress pushes for a pardon.
If President Barack Obama's election 8 years ago,
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear,
represented a milestone in the quest for American racial equality, then all of the rallies, protests,
this is where all the activity is going on,
and violent uprisings we have endured over the last few years serve as an asterisk to what progress we think we have made. So much for a post-racial America.
I'll take care of it. Okay, thank you.
But on the cusp of a new presidency, perhaps it is time to assess just how far we have come.
There's a tremendous progress that has been made.
By seeing the world through what, in our not-too-distant past, was considered a forbidden interracial love marriage. Next month, Brooklyn, New York residents Daniel and Shermia Hefner, parents to two adorable daughters, will celebrate 14 years of marriage.
50, 60 years ago, forget 100 years ago, 50, 60, 70 years ago, Daddy and I would not have been together. This could not have happened in the United States.
The everyday nature of Daniel and Shermia's union prompted us to turn back the clock a century to the early 1900s to examine the case of another American, Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight boxing champion. Johnson paid a steep price, his career and freedom, for deciding to openly marry a white woman. In fact, Johnson died with a federal conviction on his record for that so-called crime.
I mean, we're not that far removed from 100 years ago.
The U.S. government's injustice against Jack Johnson is not lost on Daniel and Shermia Hefner, who are witnesses to the wheels of change and the comfort of unconditional acceptance.
My mother couldn't be any prouder of her daughter-in-law and her granddaughters. I mean, my parents enjoy having seen, like you said, times have changed, and that, their family sort of evidences that.
The first African-American guy to win the championship, so obviously it means a lot to all fighters, not just black fighters, but white fighters as well.
Many boxing Hall of Famers salute Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight champion of the world, more than a century ago, when a black man fighting for, let alone winning, the title over a white man was unheard of.
When he first started, there was actually colored championships.
By age 24, Johnson was the colored champion, but wanted the big prize.
Tommy Burns took over as a heavyweight champion.
At Burns' matches around the world, Johnson bought ringside seats, verbally taunting him, until
Tommy Burns says, okay, I'll fight you, but I need $30,000.
At today's rate, that's the better part of $1 million.
They didn't want the world to see what a black man did to a white man.
But the fact that he did this, often with a white woman on his arm, was the height of black insubordination.
Today's equivalent of $3 million was raised to bring former champ Jim Jeffries out of retirement for the fight of the century.
Years later, he said that was the biggest mistake I ever made.
The country's great white hope threw in the towel. Not long after, Congress tried to knock out Jack Johnson.
He loved white women. He married 3 of them.
The White Slave Traffic Act, also known as the Mann Act, was a federal law targeted directly at Johnson.
To argue that he had brought his girlfriend, who later became his wife, across state lines for nefarious reasons.
He went out of the country.
Overseas, he defended his title for the next 3 years until he got knocked out by Jess Willard. But in 1920, Johnson turned himself in to U.S. authorities.
It's ridiculous, the laws they had in those days.
In prison, Johnson stayed productive and even got this patent for a new type of wrench he invented. After his release, Johnson still boxed professionally until he was 60.
Hubert's Museum was here. It was a sideshow, a freak show, really. And this is where Jack Johnson ended up.
but in 1946, he died in a car crash, penniless, at age 68. But now, Johnson is still in the fight of his life.
Jack Johnson carried on a very flamboyant lifestyle, and that made it even more offensive. But that doesn't change the fact he was a victim of racism.
U.S. Senator John McCain has been passionate in his fight to right the historical injustice that is Jack Johnson's life. But the Arizona senator does not stand alone in this complex battle, played out in Washington, D.C.'s political ring for more than a decade.
History is what we are as a country, and if we don't correct injustices, it's a stain on the nation's history.
U.S. Representatives Peter King from Nassau County, Gregory Meeks of Queens, and Senate Minority Leader Nevada Senator Harry Reid have all stood with McCain. All are leaders of a bipartisan coalition. Their fight is to honor Johnson with a full pardon, 60 years after his death.
Here we are with an opportunity to rectify something that our government did to a human being who should be classified as an American hero.
There is no question that there have been several members of Congress in Johnson's corner now for more than a decade. However, the same cannot be said about the two men who have been in the White House for most of this century, which is surprising considering that when President George W. Bush was governor of Texas, he implemented a Jack Johnson Day as a way to celebrate one of the state's most famous native sons. Then in 2008, when Barack Obama was elected president, many felt that he was uniquely qualified to pardon Johnson. Think about it for a moment. He is the first black president who celebrated his victory in Chicago just a few miles away from where Johnson is buried. And perhaps most intriguing of all, the president himself is the product of an interracial marriage.
There are definitely parallels, but it is the right thing to do.
We have a president of the United States who clearly has enormous sensitivity on these issues and yet has refused to issue a pardon, even though unanimously through Congress a pardon has been recommended. That's hard for me to understand.
All right, again, that was Mario Diaz, James Ford, and Jay Dow reporting for us tonight. As the president's time in office winds down, many are waiting to see if he will indeed pardon Jack Johnson.
PIX 11 News did reach out to the White House regarding a potential pardon for Johnson. They have not responded. Of course, we will have more on the fight to honor his life later in the week.
Well, he was America's first black heavyweight boxing champion, but decades since his death, Jack Johnson remains in a fight for his good name.
Last night, PIX 11's James Ford, Mario Diaz, and Jay Dow took a look at the effort to pardon Johnson before President Obama leaves office. A lot of people believe he was wrongly convicted for his attitude in the face of racism and for his decision to date and marry white women.
Well, several lawmakers are in Johnson's corner, and now tonight, PIX 11's Jay Dow reveals another influential figure, a powerful local leader who also recently passed. Take a look.
When we first discussed the idea of tackling the century-old criminal conviction of Jack Johnson, America's first black heavyweight boxing champion, late Brooklyn District Attorney Ken Thompson was one of the first people in a position of power willing to speak out in support of Johnson.
Hello, sir. How's it going? Good to see you.
We met with Thompson on July 1st in what was his last sit-down interview before losing his own fight with cancer. He did not say a word about his health troubles, but we now know by the time he sat for this interview, he was very ill. But D.A. Thompson was passionate about his desire to address the United States' racially motivated prosecution against Johnson, simply for dating and marrying a white woman.
Jay, it was the movement to prosecute Jack Johnson and to incarcerate him was steeped in racism. They wanted to make an example of him, to make sure that no black man ever married a white woman. And they were open about it. That's how outrageous the case was.
D.A. Thompson was more than a legal analyst for this story. During his tenure as district attorney, he created a unit dedicated to investigating wrongful convictions. 21 prisoners, many of whom spent years behind bars, were ultimately freed, because of the unit's work.
We have to be willing to correct injustices in the past. And so none of us were born when Jack Johnson was alive and the heavyweight champion of the world. But we now know that there's a grave injustice that's out there committed against this man, and really a mark on this country.
Thompson's staff attorney zeroed in on coerced confessions, tainted evidence, and false witness statements. But the culprit in Jack Johnson's case was the federal government. Members of Congress made sure he paid for his willingness to engage in interracial relationships with his boxing career and ultimately his freedom.
He was actually put in the U.S. penitentiary at Leavenworth because of his conviction. And we have to do something about that many years later.
It has been more than a century since Johnson was convicted of the Mann Act, an anti-prostitution law that was twisted and used to deem it illegal for Johnson to cross state lines in the company of a white woman. D.A. Thompson wanted his America to renew its fight for the champ, and he expressed his hopes that President Obama would overturn Johnson's conviction before leaving office.
So I'm determined to do my part as the Brooklyn DA, as someone who believes in fundamental fairness.
Ken Thompson ultimately lost his battle with cancer just 3 months after this interview, but his intentions are on the record.
Let me tell you, man, I feel strongly about this.
John Tamsin, hindsight is 2020. I can remember sitting there with Mr. Thompson, and after we wrapped the interview, he was so insistent that we needed to get this story going as quickly as possible. We need to move on this, Jay. That's what he said. Now we understand the sense of urgency he had, the cancer battle he was fighting that he ultimately lost. Now, looking back at the big picture, Mr. Thompson was well aware of the urgency involving the Jack Johnson case. President Obama still has little more than a month to act in this case, and tonight we have an update. Earlier this evening, my colleagues Mario Diaz, James Ford, and I, we heard back from the White House. Not surprisingly, a spokesman tells us that the White House does not preview what grants of clemency the president may or may not issue.
All right, all this week, PIX-11 News has presented a series on Jack Johnson. He was the first black heavyweight boxing champion. Just a few years later, though, many people say he was prosecuted, tried, and convicted just because of the color of his skin.
Well, now, decades after his death, there are major efforts, including by some local members of the U.S. Congress, to see Johnson pardoned. And they want President Obama to clear his good name before he leaves office. Well, PIX-11's Mario Diaz has part 3 of the final fight.
History is what we are as a country, and if we don't correct injustices, it's a stain on the nation's history.
The fight to resurrect the reputation of a man who is still down for the count for more than a century has been an overwhelming challenge. While Jack Johnson's legacy as the first black heavyweight champion is cemented in history, there is nothing concrete surrounding his personal legacy. Johnson never fathered any children, and as a result, he only has a handful of distant relatives, which is the reason as to why his fight for a posthumous presidential pardon is being waged by some of the biggest political heavyweights on Capitol Hill. You've been working on this for how many years now?
Since about 2004.
U.S. Representative Gregory Meeks is not only well-versed on the jabs thrown in D.C.'s political ring, but also those in the boxing ring, as he is the son of a once formidable heavyweight with a dubious distinction.
One of 49 individuals who got knocked out by Rocky Marciano.
Your father?
My father.
As a result of his father's boxing career, Meeks found himself in places most would only dream of. One of those was in Pennsylvania, where the greatest honed his craft. It was there where Meeks was able to fully comprehend the significance of Jack Johnson.
I used to go to Muhammad Ali's training camp in Deer Lake, and he had rocks that had names of boxers, former boxers on it. The biggest rock that Ali had at the camp was named Jack Johnson because he wanted to promote Jack Johnson.
Now it is Meeks who is discussing Johnson and the racism he was forced to endure.
They hated him.
While also vigorously fingering the individuals who wrongfully incarcerated the former champ.
The United States government, clearly.
The same people that you now work for.
Absolutely.
One of Meeks' colleagues in the halls of Congress is U.S. Representative Peter King out of Nassau County.
Peter King and I used to go to watch tapes of old boxers.
King is known as a fighter on the Hill. He has been Meek's partner in the House in pushing the bipartisan initiative where King says the facts speak for themselves.
I've never seen a situation which seems so clear to me and which seems so clear to everybody else.
The boxing ring has been characterized as the theater of the unexpected. The same words can describe some of our nation's most influential lawmaking landmarks. However, what does it say about the case of Jack Johnson, a historical figure who rose to greatness in the face of unparalleled adversity? That two New Yorkers from opposing parties are pivotal players in the collaboration of bipartisan legislation in an arena dominated by partisan politics.
It says that we can get things done if we work together. Put politics beside us. New Yorkers understand how to get things done.
What would a pardon of Jack Johnson mean or translate to in the U.S.?
It would be a tremendous correction of American history, and it would show how far we've come as a nation in so many different ways, because the racial component is vital, but it just also shows as a nation how we've grown, how we've matured, and we're willing to address what is not perfect about the country.
And Representative Meek's fight continues here this evening in Washington, D.C., where hours ago, PIX 11 News exclusively obtained a letter making the rounds here on Capitol Hill, authored by Meeks, in which he is asking for the Congressional Black Caucus members to sign the letter in which they are asking for Jack Johnson to be pardoned. That letter, we have learned, will be delivered to President Obama at the White House within the next 48 hours. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Mario Diaz, PIX 11 News.
All right, there are just 36 days left for President Obama to right a wrong that's been in place for 114 years.
Yeah, Jack Johnson, the first African-American heavyweight boxing champ, still considered guilty of a federal felony for doing nothing more than loving a woman who also loved him. But because she was white, he's still officially a criminal.
Well, a presidential pardon could change that forever. But what exactly is a presidential pardon, and could it be hard to come by? James Ford explains in our series, The Last Fight.
I hereby pardon you from the Thanksgiving table.
It's ironic. A bird species native to America traditionally gets a presidential pardon for not having committed any crime. But legendary heavyweight boxing champion and cultural icon Jack Johnson, who also committed no crime but served a year in federal prison, has not received a presidential pardon. Many are hopeful that he will.
It would be absolutely poetic for the first Black president to sign the posthumous pardon for the first Black world heavyweight champion.
Legends in the sport like five-time world champion Sugar Ray Leonard.
But without question, that should be done.
And the former New York boxing commissioner told us at the Boxing Hall of Fame upstate that they agree.
Jack Johnson, who never should have gotten in trouble for that trumped-up Mann Act in the beginning.
The Mann Act, or White Slave Traffic Act, was created by Congress in 1910, targeted specifically at Jack Johnson, who was at the height of an unheard-of career for a black man at that time. He had unquestionably defeated the best white boxers, Tommy Burns and Jim Jeffries, to claim and keep the world heavyweight title for 7 years.
The fact that he did this, often with a white woman on his arm, was the height of Black insubordination.
That's why federal authorities arrested him in 1912 for white slave trafficking his girlfriend, Lucille Cameron, who later became his wife. When she wouldn't cooperate with prosecutors, a spurned former girlfriend, Belle Schreiber, helped the feds convict Johnson for a consensual relationship that happened before the Mann Act was even written. The U.S. Constitution clearly states the president shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. Presidents have granted them to Confederate General Robert E. Lee, who offended the United States by leading the war against it, Richard Nixon, who was facing impeachment for crimes against the United States, and Peter Yarrow of the folk group Peter, Paul, and Mary actually had an illegal sexual relationship with a 14-year-old girl. His conviction was pardoned. The list goes on, but Jack Johnson's name has not been added, even though he committed no crime, and despite some of the biggest names in Washington, from Senators John McCain and Harry Reid and New York Congressmen Peter King and Gregory Meeks calling for it. However,
the Office of the U.S. Attorney General is, of course, here in Washington, and we spoke with the former occupant of that office here at the Department of Justice, who said that getting a pardon for this particular historical figure may be easier said than done.
Pardons that are given posthumously are very rarely done. I think you can count all of them on the fingers of one hand.
Eric Holder was, from 2009 until last year, U.S. Attorney General, a position that advises the president on pardons.
Jack Johnson, no question, was convicted unfairly. That might be an historical injustice that needs to be rethought. Now, there are, on the other side, countervailing concerns about the way in which he treated women, physically treated women. So all of this has to be balanced before this president or his successor would make a determination that a pardon was appropriate.
He was known as a womanizer. There were also reports that he beat women.
But as Teresa Runstetler, historian at American University and author of the prize-winning Jack Johnson Rebel Sojourner, points out,
nonetheless, he was wrongly convicted for something that he did not actually do.
So pardoning him now, she says, is the right thing to do.
If pardoning him means that we can have a more robust conversation about how history informs the present, I think Jack Johnson would be happy that his pardoning opened up that kind of conversation.
Now, John, we know that some kind of conversation is ongoing, but where is it headed? We told you last night how the Congressional Black Caucus formally asked the White House to seriously consider a pardon. As of tonight, though, no official word from the White House. Just under 5 weeks left for President Obama to act, Joe.
Whether the guy was a Boy Scout or not, that's not really the issue. It's about whether or not he committed a crime. So what's on tap for the last part of the series?
Well, Mario Diaz, Jay Dow, and I make our closing argument for a pardon, featuring, in their own words, two heavyweights, if you will. One, literally a heavyweight, Lennox Lewis, the prize fighter, and another political heavyweight, Barack Obama. You know who he is.
They would qualify as heavyweights. All right. All week long, PIX 11 news reporters Jay Dow, James Ford, and Mario Diaz, they have been showcasing the series The Final Fight. It's an in-depth look at boxer Jack Johnson and the battle to grant that first black heavyweight champion a posthumous pardon. We thank you for staying with us. I'm John Muller.
I'm Tamsa Vidal. It ironically comes down to President Obama. The man who campaigned on hope is actually the best chance for Johnson to receive that pardon. This as he sunsets on his presidency after Congress already has suggested a pardon to him on at least 2 occasions.
This is common sense. There should be not a reason to hesitate to pardon Jack Johnson.
Throughout our series of reports this week, we have heard from a variety of voices weighing in on what is universally viewed as a great injustice in our nation's history.
The fact is that there was a racially motivated crime committed. And it's criminal when you put an innocent person in jail, and that needs to be rectified.
That includes U.S. Senator John McCain from Arizona and Congressman Peter King of Long Island, who did not pull any punches with us in categorizing Jack Johnson's life.
First black heavyweight champion and also blackballed.
Historian Teresa Runstetler of American University, the author of an award-winning book on Johnson, summed up his federal prosecution in the simplest of terms.
He was wrongly convicted for something that he did not actually do.
We even heard a voice from beyond the grave.
Let me tell you, man, I feel strongly about this.
The late Ken Thompson, former Brooklyn district attorney, who overturned an unprecedented 21 wrongful convictions in less than 3 years in office. He went on the record with us 3 months before his unexpected death, sharing his intentions to help Johnson receive a pardon.
So I'm determined to do my part as the Brooklyn DA, as someone who believes in fundamental fairness.
We also heard from other practitioners of the sport known as the sweet science.
Jack Johnson was the first guy, so I mean, the first African-American guy to win the championship.
It was more than 6 months ago that PIX-11 News traveled upstate to Canastota, New York for the annual International Boxing Hall of Fame inductions. It was there that boxers like Jerry Cooney, once considered the modern-day Great White Hope, legendary 4-time champion Roberto Duran, and former heavyweight champ Ray Mercer, all provided their perspectives on Johnson being pardoned.
I think maybe he should because of the racial barrier within the thing.
Then this past Labor Day, prior to the West Indian Day Parade,
he's a great fighter, and he's the best of his era.
One of the premier heavyweights of the last 40 years, Lennox Lewis, weighed in with his own verbal jabs.
I think he should be pardoned. I think the whole crime that he committed it should be thrown out. And I don't even think he committed a crime. I don't call that a crime.
But there is one political heavyweight who we have not heard from, who, in an instant, can clear Johnson's record.
By the time I leave office, the number of pardons that we grant will be roughly in line with what other presidents have done.
President Barack Obama has not spoken publicly on a potential pardon for Jack Johnson. In fact, rarely do presidents comment on the overall pardon process. However, President Obama did just this back on August 4th.
The process that I put in place is not going to vary depending on how close I get to the election. So it's going to be reviewed by the pardon attorney. It'll be reviewed by my White House counsel, and I'm going to, as best as I can, make these decisions based on the merits as opposed to political considerations.
However, perhaps what was striking during our reporting was this interview with former Attorney General Eric Holder.
Jack Johnson, no question, was convicted unfairly. He was targeted for his lifestyle, for the way in which he conducted himself, and it is something I think that our nation should consider.
Holder, the nation's first black attorney general, appointed by President Obama, left us slightly confounded after this exchange.
Do you think Jack Johnson deserves a pardon?
You know, I'm really not sure. I mean, I'm not trying to duck the question. I'm just really not sure. I always abhor people who are singled out and treated inappropriately by government, and there's no question that he was that. But I'm also the father of 2 girls and married to a wonderful woman. And to know the way in which he treated women, physically abused women, gives me pause about whether or not he's a person deserving of the ultimate presidential act.
The abuse Holder is referring to is referenced towards the end of the 135-page dossier sent to us by the Justice Department. A report from October 29th, 1937, nearly 25 years to the day, Johnson was arrested by the feds for, in their eyes, violating the Mann Act. In the report, that is challenging to make out due to blurred font, the special agent who wrote it states Johnson had a history of violence towards women. However, there is no mention of Johnson being arrested or convicted in any of the listed examples of abuse. These were simply allegations. This is important to note since Johnson was arguably the most hated black man in America in the early part of the 1900s, and yet he was never arrested for beating up women. So while Holder, a close advisor to President Obama, sits on the fence regarding Johnson over acts he was never prosecuted for, it begs the question, are other advisors to the president doing the same? Because if the president plans to grant pardons, in his words now,
based on the merits as opposed to political considerations,
then Johnson's pardon should only be evaluated on the facts of his wrongful conviction, nothing else. Moreover, the current administration already has a track record of embracing an individual with a confirmed, documented history of domestic violence.
Tonight we honor the Reverend Al Green.
That is the 2014 Kennedy Center Honors Reception at the White House, praising legendary crooner Al Green, who was arrested in the 1980s for hitting his wife and admitted to it in legal testimony. So considering this, is it fair that the White House honors a confessed abuser of women, but we have yet to hear applause of freedom for Jack Johnson? Whether or not Jack Johnson secures a posthumous presidential pardon between now and the president's last day in office, Johnson's biographer, Teresa Rundstedler, says that if granted, the pardon should not be just a way for Americans to dismiss a deeply entrenched, problematic issue in the fabric of our nation.
Maybe it's not yet time to pardon him, unless it's really the start of a conversation about righting current and past wrongs, rather than just a way of sort of patting ourselves on the back and saying, look at how far we've come.
It's a fascinating case. Once again, that was PIX 11's Mario Diaz. James Ford and Jay Dow reporting a final note. Our team did reach out to the White House today. They did not respond to our questions.
2A in PIX Plaza. This is the PIX 11 News at 6 with Tamsin Fidel and John Muller.
I'm John Muller. One of history's most coveted baseball cards at the center of a pardon from the President of the United States. We thank you for being here for the PIX 11 News at 6.
Yeah, President Obama has pardoned or commuted the sentences of hundreds of convicts over the past few months. But this week, one New Yorker got the call he has been waiting for since the late 90s, and it's all thanks to a tax attorney who was looking for a challenge.
PIX 11's Mario Diaz live in Times Square, where this all began nearly 20 years ago. Mario.
John and Tamsin, if you recall, last week we talked about boxer Jack Johnson and his quest to receive a presidential pardon. He did not get that pardon on Monday. However, another man here in New York City did for a crime that took place behind me some 20 years ago. And as you mentioned, his attorney, well, she is a tax attorney.
I'm actually a tax attorney, tax and business planning.
However, earlier this week, after an 8-year campaign from an office inside of her Bay Head, New Jersey home, Valerie McGorry secured one of 78 pardons, and the only one in New York City granted by President Barack Obama. The recipient, a family friend, Benjamin Ramos of Queens.
I think it was breathtaking for him.
Back in September of 2000, Ramos pled guilty for conspiracy to transport and sell the most valuable baseball card in history, the T206 Honus Wagner card. It all took place at this corner in Times Square back in March of 1998. This was the location for the now defunct restaurant All-Star Cafe. Its investors group included various athletes like Wayne Gretzky as well as entertainers. One of them, Charlie Sheen, was an avid baseball card collector and decided to display his rare T206 Wagner card. In 1996, a similar card had sold at an auction for $640,000. Fast forward now 20 years to this past October, when a Wagner card sold for $3.1 million. So, realizing the value of the T206 card by 1998 standards, the crew stole the card, replaced it with a photocopied card made by Ramos, and he then proceeded to sell the original card to a New Jersey dealer for $18,000, far below market value. The crew struck again 1 month later with 2 other vintage cards before being nailed by the feds the following year.
And when they ended up ultimately getting caught, they all just were like, we're guilty.
Ramos worked with federal prosecutors and received 4 years probation as a result. He has since lived a productive, clean life. Meanwhile, McGorry knew she had a compelling case, adding that throughout the entire process, she displayed great humility, treating the pardon attorney for the case with tremendous respect. Also, admitting that there is one thing attorneys must do once everything is submitted.
They have to beg. I think they really have to beg.
But how does a dead man like Jack Johnson beg for a pardon?
That is a really, really hard one.
All last week, PIX 11 News chronicled the fight to pardon Jack Johnson, boxing's first black heavyweight champion that many influential members of Congress feel was targeted by the feds for not only being a historic heavyweight champ, but also for dating white women. In fact, on 2 occasions, Congress has sent President Obama resolutions suggesting Johnson should be pardoned. Yet, no pardon for Johnson.
I definitely think his name should get cleared up. His name should get cleared up.
Now, Now, I did put a call into Ramos yesterday. He did not want to go on camera with us, but he did tell me in the phone call that he learned from his mistake and he's become a much better man because of it. Now, with the results to Jack Johnson and where we stand there with our request to get some sort of reaction from the Department of Justice. If you recall, we've been pressuring them for some sort of response on this, as well as the White House. The DOJ has yet to get back to our inquiries last week. As for the White House and the comments by Eric Holder to us in our reports that Jack Johnson was treated unfairly, convicted unfairly, the White House has yet to get back to us as well. Reporting live from Times Square, Mario Diaz, PIX 11 News.
Mario, thank you very much. All right, PIX 11 News has tirelessly advocated to clear the name of a prominent, innocent man. And thanks to our efforts, the pursuit of justice for boxer Jack Johnson now taking a major leap forward to the steps of the White House. Johnson, the first black heavyweight world boxing champion, was convicted on a trumped-up charge more than a century ago.
Many people have been working to get him pardoned posthumously, but because of a series of stories this month by reporters Jay Dow, Mario Diaz, and James Ford, two major new voices are joining the effort, and their approach may very well be the most convincing one yet. James Ford joins us now with the exclusive story.
So, Kaidi and John, even though the drive to get a pardon for Jack Johnson has been valiantly taken on by political leaders and celebrities for years, our series of a half-dozen stories this month has led to the unprecedented pairing of one of the nation's foremost experts on pardons to one of Jack Johnson's few surviving family members. The results of that pairing may very well finally get justice for this innocent man.
Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight world champion in 1908, when it was unheard of for a black man to be able to hit a white man in public, let alone beat him at boxing. Our series of reports on this first global icon who lived lavishly and lovingly with white women who he married covered many aspects of one thing: that Johnson was convicted of a crime he didn't commit. The Mann Act prohibited transporting women across state lines for, quote, prostitution or debauchery or for any other immoral purpose.
The movement to prosecute Jack Johnson and to incarcerate him was steeped in racism. They wanted to make an example of him.
The last major interview with Brooklyn District Attorney Ken Thompson before his untimely passing in October. So moved Thompson's widow, LuShawn, she made a phone call.
And they said there's a group of reporters who've really worked on this issue and done a yeoman's job at it. And, can I put you in touch with them? And I said yes.
Harvard Law School professor and Criminal Justice Institute director Ronald Sullivan described the first of two phone calls.
Hello, Miss Haywood. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine.
Jay Dow brought him and one of Jack Johnson's last living relatives, Johnson's great-grand niece, Linda Haywood, together by phone.
The encounter was magical.
Have you or any family member filed a petition for pardon yet?
I didn't even know that I could file a petition.
After years of some of the most prominent names and faces nationwide trying to get President Barack Obama to formally pardon Jack Johnson, we were able to open this completely new path.
Very direct personal appeal, saying, Mr. President, I'm a family member of Jack Johnson. Here are the ways in which my family was impacted.
He needs to be pardoned so that the stigma and the shame can be removed from the family.
If you'd like me to, I'd be more than happy to begin drafting this.
Of course, I have no objection. In fact, I'm very much grateful and appreciative.
The pardon petition will include some of the same groundbreaking information former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder told Mario Diaz as part of our series.
Jack Johnson, no question, was convicted unfairly.
To my knowledge. That's the only former senior government official, but I mean, he's about as senior as you get, who says that, it was a bad conviction.
But Holder also warned,
there are, on the other side, countervailing concerns about the way in which he treated women.
That information was based in part on this FBI report we unearthed.
It was written 20 years after the episode. The FBI was engaged in all sorts of nefarious activities, and especially against black, usually men. Having said that, it shouldn't even be a consideration because that's not what he was convicted for.
The Jack Johnson pardon petition Professor Sullivan is writing, he says, is a direct result of the person we mentioned at the beginning of this story. Brooklyn DA Ken Thompson, before he died, got 21 wrongfully convicted people exonerated. Sullivan created the conviction review unit that made it happen under the simple order that Thompson told him.
We can't have innocent people in prison. It's just wrong. It's that same passion that he brought to bear with respect to Jack Johnson. The president has an opportunity to make it right.
Harvard Law School is not only the nation's oldest and most storied institution for the study of law, it's also where Professor Sullivan is a distinguished member of the faculty. And it's the alma mater of one Barack Obama, who happened to be a student here at the same time that Professor Sullivan was a student.
And I am hopeful that I can get the document in his hands personally.
For him to be pardoned, that would erase the stigma and the shame. That would make everybody feel a lot better.
Historically, many presidents do 11th hour pardons, that is, at the very end of their term. We can hope and pray that Jack Johnson's is among those.
That first encounter by phone also revealed a remarkable emotional side to Jack Johnson that the world has never seen. We'll have more of that, as well as Johnson's great-grandniece in person, as Jay Dow continues this series in its next installment from Chicago, where Johnson's family now lives. That's tomorrow on PIX11 News.
Well, PIX11 is now one step closer to getting a presidential pardon petition for Jack Johnson in front of the White House pardon attorney.
And this is happening for the very first time with the direct involvement of descendants of America's first black heavyweight champion, who is considered to be falsely convicted due to his race.
James Ford, Mario Diaz, and Jay Dow have been working on this series for months. Jay has the latest installment.
For weeks now, we have been telling you about PIX11's efforts to expose and then remedy a racially motivated injustice against Jack Johnson, America's first black heavyweight boxing champion. This week, we flew to Chicago to put a face to a name.
How you doing? Hey, I'm doing fine.
It's glad to finally meet you.
You're all the way here from New York.
We're here.
Wonderful.
The face of Linda E. Haywood, a Windy City descendant of Jack Johnson, his great-great-niece.
I'm related to Jack Johnson through one of his sisters.
Haywood still has vintage family photographs, documents, and just as importantly, an oral history, a testimony really, about the pain her great-great-uncle carried with him to his grave.
When he found out what was going to happen to him, that he was going to prison, that he came to his sister's house, Mama Janie, my great-grandmother, and he sat at her kitchen table and he cried like a baby.
All of that pain stemmed from Johnson's success in the ring over white opponents and outside the ring for his decision to date and marry white women.
Is it safe to say that your family considers this a stain, not just on Jack Johnson's legacy, but on your family's reputation?
Absolutely.
In 1913, the federal government went after Johnson with the Mann Act, named after the congressman who sponsored it. It was passed to crack down on interstate travel in the company of a prostitute, but federal prosecutors wielded it against Johnson for traveling with his white girlfriend.
And when I read about how bold he was and defiant he was, and my mother told me how he wore these fancy clothes and he had fast cars, I said, well, look, man, he's something else. The equivalent of what he was doing, we would call that swag.
Over the last few decades, the White House has indeed heard from several people in a position of power express their frustration.
He was a victim of racism.
And a desire to see Jack Johnson receive a presidential pardon.
He was actually put in the U.S. penitentiary at Leavenworth because of his conviction.
But so far, their efforts have been unsuccessful.
Back in 1912, Jack Johnson bought more than 24 plots here at Graceland Cemetery for himself and his family. And you could easily be deceived into thinking that the entire Johnson clan is buried here, because none of his living descendants have played a major role in previous books, documentaries, or congressional efforts to get the pardon.
In fact, legendary filmmaker Ken Burns' production team, which released the 2005 documentary Unforgivable Blackness: The Rise and Fall of Jack Johnson, apparently did not even realize that Johnson still has relatives who care about this case. One of Burns' producers even sent Miss Haywood a letter apologizing for not consulting her in the making of the film. Quote, "Secondly, I must deeply apologize as a producer for not having worked harder to locate relatives of Jack Johnson. We knew you must exist, but none of our historical consultants or writers knew where or how to contact you."
No one has ever consulted us or me about anything.
So now, for the first time ever, the Johnson family is now personally involved in the presidential pardon process.
I didn't even know that I could file a petition.
And Ms. Haywood is working with Harvard Law School professor Ron Sullivan, a recognized expert in the field, to get a petition drafted and before President Obama before he leaves office next month. James Ford traveled to Harvard earlier this week to speak with Professor Sullivan, who believes the family's involvement could make the difference.
Very direct personal appeal, saying, Mr. President, I'm a family member of Jack Johnson. Here are the ways in which my family was impacted.
Are there hurdles on the path to pardoning Jack Johnson? In a word, yes. Besides the fact that Johnson's case is more than 100 years old, former Attorney General Eric Holder, speaking with Mario Diaz, touched on what has been previously characterized as a trouble spot in this case. It's a report written by a federal agent in the 1930s, some 20 years after Johnson's conviction, that mentions anecdotal reports of Johnson's alleged abuse of women.
Jack Johnson, no question, was convicted unfairly, but I'm also the father of 2 girls and married to a wonderful woman, and to know the way in which he treated women, physically abused women, gives me pause about whether or not he's a person deserving of the ultimate presidential act.
Acting Brooklyn District Attorney Eric Gonzalez now heads the Conviction Review Unit created by his predecessor, Ken Thompson, with Professor Sullivan's help. DA Gonzalez says he questions the legitimacy of that federal report, especially given the period in which it was written, adding Johnson was never arrested or even charged with domestic abuse.
I read that report. I think it was clearly biased. I believe it was there to kind of support the injustice that was to validate the injustice that was done.
But most importantly, DA Gonzalez says none of that has anything to do with Johnson's conviction for simply traveling across state lines with his white girlfriend.
There is nothing in the Mann Act that caused Jack Johnson to be prosecuted other than animus. They didn't want interracial relationships between people.
PIX11's commitment to this investigation continues to be driven by what is widely perceived to be a racially motivated, antiquated decision to go after Jack Johnson. Each of us, Mario, James, and this reporter, all married a woman outside of our own race. And each of us entered into interracial marriages in the 21st century with pride and love for who we married, and without fear of persecution from the federal government.
Can you see that?
Back in Chicago, Ms. Haywood says she considers that federal agent's negative report about her great-great-uncle a piece of fiction. Her family's desire to clear Jack Johnson's name could not be more real.
People have said, what difference does it make? He's dead. He's been dead for 70 years. I'll tell you, it makes a difference because that's my family member. That's my great-great-uncle, my maternal great-great-uncle, and it matters to us because we are his family. And no family wants to have shame placed upon them for something that they did not do.
It's just a fascinating story.
So compelling.
So nuanced. That was Jay Dow reporting.
As the nation honors Dr. Martin Luther King today, we are continuing to follow the life of another influential figure associated with the battles of racial justice, legendary boxer Jack Johnson. The first black heavyweight champion is being considered for a posthumous presidential pardon. PIX11's new Mario Diaz is here with the 11th hour developments in Jack Johnson's final fight.
I hate to say it, I think it's not going to happen, but we can't give up.
The fight to pardon boxing icon Jack Johnson is in the 15th round.
I haven't been told, Congressman, forget about it. It's not going to happen.
This, according to U.S. Representative Gregory Meeks of Queens, an advocate in the effort to pardon Johnson for more than a decade.
I'm told that we have it, we understand it, we're reviewing it.
Professor Ron Sullivan, the director of the Criminal Justice Institute at Harvard Law School, informed PIX11 News last week that he was filing the pardon petition with the goal for it to be fast-tracked within the ranks of the Department of Justice towards its final destination, President Obama's desk in the Oval Office. All of this occurred after Professor Sullivan viewed our initial reports in our series, The Final Fight, a series that was instrumental for him, as he expressed to James Ford during a recent interview in Boston.
You did some really excellent research and helped me think through angles and approaches.
One of those angles includes focusing on a comment former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder made during our interview last July.
Jack Johnson, no question, was convicted unfairly. He was targeted for his lifestyle.
That comment from President Barack Obama's former Attorney General, who was also the nation's first black Attorney General, is significant considering that from 2009 to 2015, Holder was the nation's chief law enforcement officer. For U.S. Representative Peter King of Nassau County, the words convicted unfairly, as well as the fact that Sullivan was planning to reference our interview with Holder in the pardon petition, validates the efforts that he, Representative Meeks, along with U.S. Senator John McCain and former Senator Harry Reid, have pushed on Capitol Hill for years.
It's very significant that Eric Holder, as a former Attorney General, is saying that. I wish he had said that while he was in office.
Professor Sullivan is also pursuing another angle, which emerged during a phone call orchestrated by our Jay Dow at the behest of Sullivan.
You or any family member filed a petition for pardon yet?
I didn't even know that I could file a petition.
As a result of PIX11 News connecting Professor Sullivan with Linda Haywood, the great-great-niece of Jack Johnson, a pardon petition for the first time has been written on behalf of Johnson's descendants.
That could have a very real personal impact on the president.
Many have said it would be symbolic for the first black president, who coincidentally is the product of an interracial marriage, to pardon the first black heavyweight champion, who was targeted by the federal government for not only beating up white champions in the ring, but also dating and marrying white women outside of it. However, the rare act of a posthumous presidential pardon will be most meaningful for Haywood and her family, which for decades has lived with this historical injustice.
People have said, what difference does it make? He's dead. He's been dead for 70 years. I'll tell you, it makes a difference because that's my family member. And no family wants to have shame placed upon them for something that they did not do.
Taking all of the recent developments into consideration, what are the chances this stain on our nation's history will ultimately produce a successful resolution before President Obama leaves office? This remains unclear, as a White House spokesperson would not comment to PIX11 News over numerous requests in the last week. Meanwhile, Representative King is holding on to the one theme that President Obama campaigned vigorously on, the one that swept him into office in 2008: hope.
After all these years, I just hope we can get it done for the sake of Jack Johnson, the sake of the country, and I think it will be very meaningful for President Obama's legacy.
In the sport of boxing, a fighter is always in it until the final bell, which means that Jack Johnson will have a puncher's chance until this Friday, when President Barack Obama is set to leave the White House.